thank you, Sherry, for that introduction, and thank you to the Alabama Department of Archives and History for having me today. Before I get started, I'll do a quick, or my boss will get mad at me, I'll do a quick plug for the Papers of Abraham Lincoln. The Papers of Abraham Lincoln is a nonprofit project where we are trying to collect everything written to or by Abraham Lincoln from his presidency years and before, and eventually it's all going to be available free online in a searchable database. It'll be the largest such collection ever amassed. We've been at it for years already. I've only been with the project 2 years, and I've been at the National Archives that whole time, and I've already found 2 documents written by Lincoln that nobody thought existed before. So we're uncovering lots of good stuff. So if you know of anyone who owns any Lincoln documents, please contact us and let us know. We're always on the hunt for new Lincoln things, and there's all kinds of them out there in private hands that we don't know about. And of course, you can always feel free to donate money to us. We always appreciate money. Today I'm going to talk to you about Dixie, although I'm going to backtrack out of this slide very quickly before we get started. And this is drawn from, as Sherry said, this is drawn from my book, Battle Hymns, The Power and Popularity of Music in the Civil War. And Dixie was extremely important, if not the most important song of the Civil War. But before I start talking about Dixie, I want to do a little quick exercise with you. I'm going to play a song for you here, once I can get it up on my iPod. All right, and I want you to see if you recognize this song. Don't say the name of it, but anyone raise your hand if you actually know what that song was. That's what I thought. All right. Now see if you recognize this song. Raise your hand if you know what song this is. Of course you do. Which one of these songs sold 1 million copies in the 19th century? The first one. The first song was probably the highest selling song of the 19th century, Weeping, Sad and Lonely, or When This Cruel War Is Over, written during the Civil War by Charles Carroll Sawyer, who self-published it from his publishing house in New York City. It was phenomenally popular, both during and after the war. Again, 1 million copies of sheet music sold. Those kind of numbers, I mean, today we talk about album sales. That doesn't seem that impressive. In the 19th century, that's extremely impressive. Plus, most people aren't learning songs by buying sheet music in the 19th century. They're learning them from each other. So that's only the number of copies actually sold. When you consider that many copies are out there, then it would have been disseminated from those people. Pretty much anyone in America would have known Weeping, Sad and Lonely. Dixie, I don't mean to imply that Dixie was not a phenomenal hit in the 19th century. Dixie was a huge hit song in the 19th century. Probably as popular, if not more so, than Weeping, Sad and Lonely. The point I'm trying to make is, we don't know Weeping, Sad and Lonely. We know Dixie. So why do we know Dixie? Dixie is obviously more than just a song. There's more going on with Dixie, because we all remember Dixie. Everybody knows Dixie. In Canada, I knew Dixie. People in Europe will know Dixie, and people north and south. I mean, I know I'm in Alabama, but I think if I did this exact same exercise for the people of the Lincoln Papers in Springfield, Illinois, they would also know Dixie. And the reason for this, I think, is because Dixie, unlike, say, When This Cruel War Is Over, all kinds of layers of political and social meaning got grafted on to Dixie. Indeed, Dixie itself isn't Dixie ends up acquiring all these different meanings and this power for people who listen to it that were completely unintended by its author, as you'll see. Dixie almost accidentally becomes the song that we think of it now. Of course, most of us, the association we have, I don't think I'm giving anything away about the talk, to say that we all think of Dixie as the national anthem of the Confederacy. And to a certain extent it was, although some people remain not too happy about that, as we'll see. And the way Dixie gets to become the national anthem of the Confederacy is a very winding and curvy road full of kind of accidents that catapulted up to that status. And so to start with, we'll talk about then where this song comes from. And Dixie is not written, unlike Weeping Sad and Lonely, which was written in 1861. Dixie is written before the Civil War even begins. It's written in 1859, and it's not written by a Southerner. It is written by a performer from Mount Vernon, Ohio, who at the time is living in New York City, named Daniel Decatur Emmett. This is Daniel Decatur Emmett near the end of the 19th century, when he is near the end of his life. There is a picture of Emmett from his younger days in full blackface, made up for his stage performances that I couldn't use because I can't get the rights to it because I can't find the original. But I encourage any of you to go and Google. If you do a Google image search for Daniel Decatur Emmett, you'll see that picture. It's him in blackface. He's holding a skull in kind of a comic pose. And Emmett, like I said, was born in Mount Vernon, Ohio, so he's a Yankee. He was born in 1815. And very early on, he showed an aptitude for music. He played the fiddle. He played the fife. He actually enlists as a musician in the Army during the Black Hawk War in Ohio, which Lincoln also fought in. And at the age of 15, at only 15, Emmett writes his first hit song. His first hit song is called Old Dan Tucker, and here it is being played by Bruce Springsteen. That, by the way, is from an album Springsteen released a few years ago of kind of American Classics, which is a tremendous album. I recommend anyone to get it. Not that Springsteen needs a plug from me or anything, but it's a great album. But Dan Tucker was a huge hit, remained a hit throughout the 19th century, so already at 15, Emmett is building a name for himself as a songwriter. However, Emmett's career kind of plateaus out after that, and in the 1840s, fast forward to the 1840s, Emmett is looking for a new angle for his stage show. By the 1840s, the most popular, and some would say first original genre of American music has started to take off, and that is minstrelsy. For those of you who don't know, minstrelsy is based around performance in blackface, and so a white performer would put burnt cork on their face to appear as though they were an African American. They would perform on stage, singing songs that were supposedly the sorts of plantation songs that slaves would sing in the South, and they would, and usually to comic effect. This is meant to be, oh, look how funny African Americans are. There's definitely a racist tinge behind minstrelsy. By the time Emmett starts to think about doing minstrelsy, it is in its infancy. And in 1843, Emmett and a group of other musicians form what they call a minstrel troupe. In fact, they may have been the first to use the word minstrelsy, where a group of them will paint themselves up. They call themselves the Virginia Minstrels. They sit in a semicircle on the stage, and they perform these minstrel songs. They perform these, another, which becomes a staple of minstrelsy, they perform stump speeches where one of them will get up and pretend to be a politician or to be an African American voicing his opinion on politics, which again was considered comical because an African American wasn't supposed to have any opinions on politics because they were slaves, and so they would say funny things. They would comically mimic the dialect of African Americans. And so Emmett becomes a seminal figure in the founding of minstrelsy by creating this minstrel troupe and performing throughout the country. And this is really where he makes his name and becomes one of the most prominent and well-known songwriters and performers in the United States. By the 1850s, Emmett is no longer really performing as much. He has been employed by the late 1850s by another minstrel troupe called Bryant's Minstrels in New York City. And it's Emmett's job to write songs for Bryant's Minstrels. And as the story goes, in March of 1859, they approach Emmett and tell him they need a song quickly for the end of a new show that they've come up with. At the very end, there would be a big number that's called a walk-around. And they wanted Emmett to write a new song to do for this walk-around. And so Emmett sat down at his desk in his New York apartment. It was raining outside, and in his words, he didn't write it for any other reason than, quote, it had to be done. He wrote it because he had been asked to do it, because he was hired to do it, and looking outside at the northern weather, that it was cold and it was gloomy, the line starts echoing in his head, I wish I was in Dixie, and so he takes that for his start. The product is this song that very much reflects Emmett's overall philosophy of songwriting. As he wrote in a book of songs of his, a songbook where he would scratch down ideas for songs, he wrote that when he created these songs, he always sought to, quote, be true to the Negro and to the crude ideas of the slave. So these songs are clearly meant to be interpreted as being in the voice of an African American, and also to reflect this kind of idea that African Americans are intellectually inferior and very sentimental. So it's not based on the way minstrels would have thought about African American culture. It's not surprising that Dixie is kind of a sentimental song where he's wishing he was back in the South in Dixie. He apparently wrote the song that night, performed it for his wife the next day. His wife was immediately struck by what a beautiful song this was, and basically says this is going to be a hit song, and that's the first kind of clue Emmett gets that he might really be onto something. He then performs it for Bryant's Minstrels, and they also immediately get on board. And so the song becomes immediately, after it's performed by Bryant's Minstrels in 1859, it becomes immediately a hit song in the North. This is one of the first printings of Dixie as sheet music, and it is printed in New York City. It is not printed in the South. And Dixie, I don't know sales statistics for Dixie like I do for When This Cruel War Is Over, because nobody bothered to write them down, but it's evident that the song is extremely popular. New York newspapers throughout the nation comment on its wild popularity. Emmett himself said he, quote, made a hit at once, and before the end of the week that it was performed, everybody in New York City was whistling it. Long before Whistling Dixie, of course, became a cliche, Emmett was already talking about it. I would say, based on from what I've seen, I would say Dixie was undoubtedly the most popular new minstrel song in the North in 1859 and 1860. It was played at James Buchanan's last party that he threw in the White House before stepping down as president, and it was used extensively by Abraham Lincoln during his political rallies as he ran for president. Not a big hit in the South, at least not in 1859 and not for most of 1860. Why is it not a hit in the South? It's not a hit in the South because Southerners, before the Civil War, don't have much interest in minstrelsy. Southerners don't have much interest in minstrelsy because they don't need to see white people painting themselves up as African Americans performing like African Americans, or supposedly like African Americans as they saw it, on stage. Southerners have the genuine article living amongst them, so they don't have much use for minstrelsy, and so minstrel songs, well, I mean, surely Southerners were aware of minstrelsy. Surely some of them would have known, songs of Stephen Foster, but minstrel songs are not really going to be big hits in the pre-war South. Where if a song like Dixie, if a minstrel song is going to make any headway into the South, it's going to do it in the cities. Because there's going to be more of a thriving theater culture. And no city in the South has a theater culture like New Orleans does. So it's not surprising that it's New Orleans where Dixie first shows up in the South. In the spring of 1860, so now we're a year after it was even written, Dixie appears in a stage show, a burlesque, called Pocahontas. Which again, there's a bit of a disconnect there. Why are they singing Dixie in a play about Pocahontas? I have no idea, because I have no idea what actually happened in Pocahontas. The newspapers don't say. But they do say that one of the big numbers in Pocahontas is this rousing performance of Dixie. Soon thereafter, a minstrel performer named J. Newcomb comes to New Orleans and also performs Dixie. And actually, he subsequently goes to Charleston and performs Dixie there. And so Dixie starts to very slowly spread throughout the South from Charleston and New Orleans. In fact, the first edition of Dixie published in the South is, pressing the wrong button here, there we go, was published in New Orleans by P.P. Werlein. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but notice it looks very similar to the Northern edition, but this is published in New Orleans, the first Southern edition to be published. And in fact, the publisher ends up in trouble for it. When the Union takes over New Orleans, they shut down his publishing house for having published Dixie and other pro-Confederate songs, but particularly Dixie, because it becomes such a symbol of Confederate nationalism. And so, as Dixie starts to spread through the South, it starts to gain ground, it starts to become increasingly popular, and its popularity really starts to peak. It becomes widely known in the South right around the end of 1860. And what else is going on at the end of 1860? The end of 1860, Abraham Lincoln is getting elected president, and the South is seceding from the Union. And so these two, again, kind of accidentally, the popularity of this song that's seen as kind of representing the region, and the region declaring its independence and trying to form an independent country of its own, these things happen at the same time. And so Dixie and the Confederacy become fused together. I argue in the book that during the Civil War, soldiers set what songs would be popular during the Civil War. Soldiers enthusiastically embraced songs that they felt represented their interests, helped them define why they were fighting, what they were fighting for. And then soldiers, as they marched throughout the country, would spread these songs. They kind of acted like giant concert tours as they made their way through the country, particularly in the South, where you're having more armies marching around than in the North, because except for a few prominent examples, there isn't that much actual combat taking place in the North. And it's soldiers who embrace Dixie in the South first. These soldiers, as they are joining up with new Confederate, or before the Confederacies even formed, state militia or state infantry regiments, they are physically ripping old Union anthems out of their songbooks. They're not going to play the Star-Spangled Banner anymore. They're not going to play Hail Columbia anymore. They're not going to play Yankee Doodle anymore. All those songs mean the United States of America. They want songs that mean the Confederate States of America. And these guys are sitting in the audience in Charleston and in New Orleans, and they're seeing these performers sing Dixie. And they're saying, aha, that's the song. That's what we're going to play instead. And so the armies in particular take up Dixie as kind of their song to represent the South and to represent their desire to fight for the South and gain its independence. And so once the soldiers pick up Dixie, then it's really going to take off, because everywhere they go, they're going to perform Dixie, they're going to sing Dixie, people are going to hear it, and it's going to end up becoming connected to the Confederacy. Again, almost accidentally, Dixie gets an endorsement from the Confederate government itself. Here in Montgomery, in February of 1861, Jefferson Davis is inaugurated as the first Confederate president. the band leader that is hired, they need a band, right? Well, Jefferson marches, or Davis marches up to the state capitol, and after he's, inaugurated, they need a band there to play songs. And they hire a local band leader named Hermann Frank Arnold. There he is. Hermann Frank Arnold is a Prussian, and he is living here in Birmingham, and he has become the kind of most prominent musical band leader in, I think he plays, I was trying to remember this, I think he plays the cornet himself, but he's a band leader here in Montgomery. And he's hired to provide the music for Davis's inauguration. Arnold doesn't know what to play. Depending on what day you caught Arnold, according to the interviews he's left behind, Arnold was recommended to Arnold either by his wife or by a young girl he knew that he play this new song that she just heard at some stage performance here in town, this new song called Dixie. That would be the perfect thing to play. And so Arnold decides that he's going to play Dixie at Davis's inauguration. Dixie, of course, isn't written to be played by a brass band, so Arnold sits down and writes his own notation for Dixie to be played by a brass band. This is the copy that he wrote. It's in this building. You can see this actual piece of sheet music. It's here in the archives. And Arnold writes it out, and he plays the song twice during Davis's inauguration. He plays it once as the procession is marching towards the state capitol, and then after Davis is proclaimed Confederate president and they shoot up the Confederate flag, he plays it again. So Dixie is played twice at this ceremony, and even though Davis didn't recommend the song to be played, no one in the Confederate government recommended the song be played, because it's played here at such an important seminal event for the foundation of the Confederacy, it becomes the de facto Confederate anthem. If it wasn't already considered to be intricately tied to the Confederacy, now it's the Confederate anthem. Even though no one ever officially declares Dixie the Confederate anthem. I want to make that clear right here at the outset. But it's being played at Davis's inauguration that makes it into the unofficial anthem of the Confederacy. Arnold later says that Davis approaches him after the ceremony and says that he really liked that Arnold played Dixie, and if it was up to him, Dixie would be the anthem of the Confederacy. I'm dubious about this. There's no real other evidence that Jefferson Davis endorsed Dixie as the national anthem of the Confederacy, and there's some other things Arnold said later in his life that I'll talk about later that I'm a little dubious about, so I'm not sure whether this is true or not, but nevertheless, Davis did have a little music box that played Dixie that he kept in the Confederate White House because the Union Army finds it when they take the city, and there's lots of commentary on the fact they found this little music box that plays Dixie. And so after this happens, Dixie starts to pop up at other official or semi-official Confederate ceremonies. When Fort Sumter surrenders, Dixie is played by Confederate bands. When Virginia secedes from the Union, they play Dixie in Richmond to celebrate it. Even before Virginia secedes, the Richmond Dispatch declares the song the, quote, national anthem of secession. By June of 1861, the New York Times reports that the Southern people, by general consent, have adopted Dixie as their national air. By the end of 1861, a British war correspondent traveling with the Confederate Army says, "It is marvelous with what wildfire rapidity this tune of Dixie has spread over the whole South." He added, "It now bids fair to become the musical symbol of a new nationality, and we shall be fortunate if it does not impose its very name on our country." And of course, he was 100% right about that. The term Dixie, being synonymous with South, or in the 1860s with Confederacy, was a new thing. It comes from the song, not vice versa. Dixie was a nickname for the South that was primarily just used within the small circle of minstrel performers. It was a term they used as a nickname for the South. It was not widely known as a nickname for the South. The song's popularity makes Dixie a nickname for the South that everyone becomes familiar with. And that's a testament to how incredibly popular this song must have been on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. That Northerners and Southerners, almost immediately after the war begins, start referring to the South as Dixie in their letters home and in their diaries that they're writing. And that's because of the song. It's the song that's introduced that word into the American lexicon. In fact, even Confederate textbooks that are published during the war for children have Dixie in them in primers as words that Confederate children should learn. They should learn what Dixie means. So that, again, this is all new, and this is all a result of the song. And what does Dixie have going for it then? What part of it, of course, is that Dixie is undoubtedly a catchy song. I think we can all agree that Dixie is a pleasant song to listen to, and that definitely is part of what makes it so popular in the first place. I think what makes it popular with soldiers, too, is it has a very steady rhythm. So it's very easy. This is why Arnold probably adopts it. It's very easy to make it a marching song, too. So if you're on the march, you can play Dixie. It kind of has a lot of get up and go to it. The first verse and chorus of Dixie are very appropriate to, or at least fairly appropriate, to Confederate nationalism. Now, as you'll see, they are written in blackface dialect, right? They are written in a kind of comical approximation of how African Americans were supposed to speak. Notice in the first line you have "duh, land of cotton." I'm not going to read them in dialect, but the first verse, as you can see, is "I wish I was in the land of cotton. Old times there are not forgotten. Look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. In Dixie's land where I was born in, early on one frosty morning, look away, look away, look away, Dixieland. Then I wish I was in Dixie. Hooray, hooray. In Dixie's land I'll take my stand." These are the key two lines, I think. "In Dixie's land I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie." As Confederate General John B. Gordon wrote after the war, "These are the words, and the only words, which are inseparably associated with the great struggle." These two, this first verse and the chorus, are the parts that when people think of Dixie and think of it as being some kind of statement of Confederate nationalism, even though, again, it was not written to be so, these are the lyrics they're thinking about. Because the problem is that the rest of Dixie has absolutely nothing at all to do with Confederate nationalism. The rest of Dixie is a typical minstrel story. You can tell that Emmett wrote it one night, or even if not, if he's exaggerating saying one night, he wrote it very quickly, because it's just basically a potpourri of minstrel cliches all thrown together. The thrust of Dixie is that it's a story, again, spoken by a slave, African American who's apparently now in the South, but he was in Dixie, although the song doesn't really make clear how he ever ended up in the South. He's mainly talking about, he's worried about his mistress. His mistress is apparently a widow, and she has begun being courted by Will the Weaver, who Emmett condemns as a gay deceiver. And it's clear that the slave is worried that Will is going to seduce the mistress so that he can inherit the plantation. And she dies, and it looks like he does inherit the plantation. I think you're supposed to infer from that maybe he sells it, and that's how the speaker in the song ends up somewhere other than in Dixie, and so that's why he wishes he was there. The song really doesn't make a lot of sense. Again, the song really lyrically looks like it's been thrown together, and clearly not about Confederate nationalism. And so this is a problem, and Confederates at the time saw it as a problem. Some of who noticed that this song was written in blackface. It's inherently problematic for a lot of Confederates that their national anthem is written to be spoken in blackface. And even if they're not that bothered by the fact that it's written in minstrel dialect, other than the first verse and chorus, it has nothing to do with Confederate nationalism. The first solution, one of the solutions many of them come up for it is to just rewrite the song. And so one of several revisions of Dixie appear. And they've all got very typical names. There's a North Carolina Dixie. I think there is an Alabama Dixie. My favorite is titled Dixie with Southern Words. None of these really take off. The only one that gets really any legs is this version, the War Song of Dixie, which is written by Albert Pike, who's a Confederate general and an Indian agent. And Albert Pike's version is much, his lyrics are much more appropriate to the secession movement and to the Confederate experiment. He says, "Southrons, hear your country call you, up, lest worse than death befall you, to arms, to arms, to arms in Dixie. Lo, all the beacon fires alighted, let all hearts be now united, to arms, to arms, to arms in Dixie. Advance the flag of Dixie, hurrah, hurrah, for Dixie's land will take our stand and live and die for Dixie, to arms, and conquer peace for Dixie." But even this version, I would say, I mean, it shows up from time to time amongst Confederate soldiers and Confederate civilians, but I didn't see it a lot. I mean, I saw a little more than the other versions, but I think most people, for better or for worse, remain happy with Dixie as it was originally written. And it's the version that I think most people in the Civil War are singing. Either that or they're just, one of the things that's very common in the Civil War is to just not sing the lyrics for whatever song you're singing. So they could have also just been making up lyrics that were different. The other way that Confederates and Southerners react to Dixie's problems is to try to explain them away and to reconcile the song to the secession movement. The most extreme example of this that I found was the Richmond Dispatch, which argues that the song is in fact about the secession movement. It's just kind of written in a code. And so the Richmond Dispatch argues that Will the Weaver was in fact Abraham Lincoln, who was seducing the American public, the missus, into symbolically marrying him. According to this line of reasoning, the paper deduced that Emmett found this seduction so heinous that he repeatedly urged Southerners to look away because they couldn't see this happening because it was so awful. In the third verse, the missus dies. And in the fourth verse, Emmett begins the fourth verse with the line, "Now here's a health to the next old missus." The Dispatch interpreted this as the South's death under Republican rule and rebirth as the Confederacy. And so at the end of the article, the author triumphantly asks, can anyone now fail to see that in the verses of this deservedly popular song, an epitome is given of the events which since last November have shaken this land? Now, I think it would have been a neat trick for Emmett to have, even if this person is correct, which I strongly doubt, it would have been a neat trick for Emmett to have done that, since in 1859, Emmett would have had to have somehow psychically predicted that Abraham Lincoln was going to win the presidency, and the South was going to react by seceding and forming the Confederacy. So I don't think there's much credit to that line of reasoning, but nevertheless, it shows just how far some Southerners were willing to go to explain away this song that they had all become so fond of. And so again, I think part of the reason why these things aren't real problems for a lot of Confederates is again because it's soldiers who are really driving the popularity of this song. As I alluded to a moment ago, soldiers, from what I found, when they embraced the song, they weren't. Today, in the 19th century, people had very different ideas about ownership of music. We have a reverence for official versions of songs that 19th century listeners didn't have. So the example I used recently is when we hear a song by the Beatles, let's pretend I'm in a band. If I decide to get up on stage in that band and I'm going to perform Help by the Beatles, if I get up and sing different lyrics, you're going to either think that I'm doing something kind of weird, or you're going to think I'm committing some kind of sacrilege, right? We consider these versions official, these versions that we get from the radio that are by actual performers. Well, in the 19th century, this was not the case. Most people who sang Dixie probably didn't know who Daniel Decatur Emmett was, let alone had ever actually heard him or a minstrel performer sing the song. To them, it was just a song that they knew. And so 19th century songs are constantly being revised by the people performing them, right? They're also not listening to these songs on a device like we are, right? We're always getting music projected at us. that's not the way it worked in the 19th century. In the 19th century, if you liked a song, you would get together with your family or your friends and you would perform it together. You would sing it together, or you would have it performed in groups, so you were getting a communal experience. And so lyrics, as a result, weren't sacrosanct. You could change lyrics around, because you basically got ownership of the song once you started performing it yourself. And so soldiers were particularly apt to do this. And so one of the reasons why soldiers really don't care whether the lyrics of Dixie are appropriate or not is because they're probably not singing them. Or they're at least singing these first two verses, and then they're pretty much ignoring the rest. And I found the same thing is happening in the North. In the North, the really popular song is John Brown's Body. And John Brown's Body almost really has no lyrics. It has a chorus, but it's completely flexible as to what the lyrics would be. And that's why soldiers love it so much, because they can just insert whatever they want. The little inside jokes, whatever kind of political messages they wanted. And I think the same thing is happening in the South with Dixie. So soldiers are going to get particularly attached to this song. It's being played on the home front like crazy as well, but soldiers are really attached to it. And I think in the home front, there's more of a rivalry with the other main Confederate anthem, the Bonnie Blue Flag. But I don't think in the armies the Bonnie Blue Flag ever really comes close to approaching Dixie as the main kind of anthem for the Confederacy. And so then what happens is, as soldiers perform this song more and more as they go through the war, they're experiencing then they're experiencing the war as they're having this song, as the song is becoming part of their lives. So the song is becoming connected to their wartime experiences. And so almost by inertia, Dixie is remaining popular with soldiers and is becoming more closely and closely connected to them emotionally, to their cause, and to their service. As a Confederate surgeon said, Dixie brings to mind the memory of friends who loved it, friends the light of whose lives were extinguished in blood, whose spirit were quenched in violence. All right, so for these soldiers, Dixie becomes a symbol of their service. It becomes a symbol of what they went through, of what they suffered fighting for the Confederacy. Nevertheless, there is enduring opposition to Dixie throughout the war. Some Confederates and Southerners never reconcile themselves to this song for obvious reasons. The lyrical content written by a Northerner. A writer to the Richmond Dispatch complains that I make no objection to the tune. It is bold and even pleasing, yet it smells too strongly of the N-word to assume a dignified rank of a national song. The Mobile Mercury argued that it is absurd to imagine that Dixie, a dancing, capering, rowdyish, bacchanalian Negro air, could ever be sung by a nation of free men, italicized free, with any respect for themselves. Some more broadly condemn all the Confederate anthems, which they feel were never up to par. An Irish soldier rued the many metrical villainies which have been palmed off on the long-suffering Southern people under the name of national anthems. And as the war goes on, especially for civilians, this starts to become the prominent view. As it becomes obvious to people that the Confederacy is going to lose, the Confederate songs that they were so emboldened by early in the war start to take on the opposite connotation. They start to sound like defeat. One Georgia woman in 1865 said that she tried to sing Dixie, but she couldn't because it sounded like a dirge. Immediately after the surrender at Appomattox, some members of the Army of Northern Virginia are actually in a house, or it may have been a bar, I don't remember where exactly they were, but with some Union soldiers, and they start singing each other's songs at to one another. And a Confederate stands up and basically credits Union anthems and the lack of anthems in the Confederacy for Union victory. He says, if we'd had your songs, we'd have licked you out of your boots. Who couldn't have marched and fought with such songs? We had nothing, absolutely nothing, except a bastard Marseillaise, Confederates played the Marseillaise a lot, the Bonnie Blue Flag, and Dixie, which were nothing but jigs. And so, by the time you get to the end of the war, Dixie has a very complicated status. Dixie is still considered to be the national anthem of secession and of the Confederacy. Some Confederates have turned on it. Some Confederates never liked it to begin with. Further complicating things is that the song never really stopped being popular in the North. as it became more and more associated with Confederacy, there were some problems. There's some people are arrested in New York City for singing the song in public at one point. I think they're foreign performers too, so they probably didn't know what they were getting into. But it never really dies out. And Northerners react the same way Southerners do. They just start creating new lyrics that are pro-Northern lyrics to the song. And famously, at the end of the war, Lincoln, who was fond of the song and who had used it in his campaign, reclaims the song as a national song rather than a Confederate song. After Richmond falls, he visits Richmond, and on his way back from Richmond, or when he gets back from Richmond in D.C., he's giving a speech, and he says, "I have always thought Dixie one of the best tunes I have ever heard. Our adversaries over the way attempted to appropriate it, but I insisted yesterday that we fairly captured it. I presented the question to the Attorney General, and he gave it as his legal opinion that it is our lawful prize." Earlier, when he was in Richmond, he had turned to someone who was with him, and he'd requested a band play Dixie, and he said, "It is good to show the rebels that, with us in power, they will still be free to hear it again." So Lincoln, this isn't just a joke for Lincoln. I think this is Lincoln is using Dixie as a way to foster reconciliation. This wasn't a Confederate song. This was a national song. We're willing to play it. We know you love it. And so Dixie tries to get held up then as a symbol of reconciliation rather than as a symbol of secession. And some Confederates go for this. A Confederate band from the Army of Northern Virginia after Appomattox travels north to Washington and actually performs in Ford's Theater just a few days before Lincoln is assassinated there. And they play Dixie in Ford's Theater. And again, this is shown as, they're playing it for a Northern audience. This is shown as being, all right, let's take this song out of the context that it got over the last 5 years, and let's make it a national song again. Following the Civil War, there was an overall decline in the popularity of Civil War music, as the wartime generation wants to separate itself from what they saw in the war. They start to decline. They start to care less about those songs. But Dixie comes back eventually. In the late 19th century, Dixie again becomes a popular song, and it's again embraced by particularly Southerners who want to endorse a pro-Confederate view of the war. And so Dixie eventually will reclaim its status as a fundamentally Confederate song, if it ever lost that. And I think it still has that today. And if I'm reading my clock right, I'm almost out of time, right? So I'll leave it at that, and because I'd like to have some questions. I'm sure you have things to ask me, and thank you for listening. Yeah, I didn't get to the stuff that I was going to, so that's why. Oh, yeah, actually, I will show you the very last slide, though, yes, which I want to... you can all... Whoop, and I lost it. So feel free to like me on Facebook. There's my son. Loving my book, so...
We have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. I'll hand you the microphone to speak into. We are recording this, so please speak into the microphone. Any questions?
I'm going to ask a question about your work on the Lincoln Papers project.
Okay.
What are some of the more interesting items that you found in your work?
Well, it's funny. Papers, people ask me that a lot. We just kind of get randomly, assigned to record groups in the National Archives. So like when I first got hired, they assigned me to Indian Affairs, and I just went through all the papers from the Bureau of Indian Affairs for the Warriors, looking for anything from Lincoln. Then I got assigned to the post office. Now I'm on the Provost Marshal files. A couple of obviously the two Lincolns I found, neither of them were particularly interesting for what they said, but finding two previously unknown Lincolns was obviously a highlight for me. One of them wasn't even where it was supposed to. Well, I mean, who knows where it was supposed to be, but it was. I was looking through a box of telegrams, and there was a telegram. It shows, I guess, why it's good that we're going through every single thing we can find, because there was a telegram that had nothing to do with Lincoln. It wasn't written to Lincoln, and I opened it up, and wrapped up inside it was a Lincoln autograph letter signed, so presumably no one had probably seen that letter since it got shoved in that box. who knows how long ago. So that was pretty interesting. The other really interesting thing for me, I got assigned to the papers of the Commissary General of Prisoners. And what I found in there that really struck me is just tons of letters from Confederate women or Southern women, because they wouldn't have called themselves Confederate in these letters, because they were writing sometimes to Lincoln himself, which is why a lot of them ended up getting into our project, asking for pardons for their husbands or fathers who had been taken as POWs in battle. And a lot of them were very interesting. A lot of them were, spitting on the Confederacy and, we would never have joined up with this, but my brother was conscripted or whatever. And I just thousands and thousands of these. It's just a great resource that I think at some point somebody needs to look at. On Monday, I found a letter from John Wilkes Booth, which doesn't make it into the project, obviously, but I stumbled across his file. Obviously after he shot the president, an investigation was done. What I'm looking at are files of people that the Union or that the federal government were investigating for Confederate sympathies, and so I found John Wilkes Booth's file, and therein it was a letter written by John Wilkes Booth in his own hand, which I obviously had never seen before. So that was kind of neat as well. So, anyone else?
What is the meaning of the phrase "look away"?
It's an excellent question. I'll be honest, I don't really have one. I mean, it sounds like a cop-out, but my eventual conclusion on Dixie is that there's a lot of nonsense in Dixie. I think there was a book written recently, and there's actually one of the things I didn't get to talk about today that I'd planned on, but I went a little long, is that Dixie's authorship, probably more than any other song in American history, Dixie's authorship has been challenged. All kinds. I think I forget the number. Somebody actually did the number. It's only there's been 54 or something different people have challenged Emmett's authorship of Dixie. And I tend to believe the Emmett story, just because there doesn't seem to be enough evidence to overturn it, and because Emmett tells the same story throughout his life. One of the main things people will say as evidence that Emmett couldn't have written it is that his story, the fact that he wrote it in one night, seems too outlandish, right? Seems too extreme. He couldn't have written it in one night. Musically, I mean, it's a beautiful song. So musically, I think there may be some headway to that. In that, could he have written that tune overnight? Lyrically, I have no doubt that he could have written that tune overnight because it doesn't make any sense. I don't think it's very hard. I mean, I'm not an English critic. I'm not I'm not a literary scholar. I have a BA in English, but that's all. And I can't make heads or tails of those lyrics. So as far as Look Away, I mean, the best I could come up with is that he's in the North, so he's saying, I'm looking away to Dixie. But it certainly isn't what the Richmond Dispatch said it was. But I really couldn't tell you. I think it's just a bunch of little. I think Emmett wrote a song that could be performed quickly, that would sound pleasing if performed on stage, and so he threw in all these. At this point, Emmett's been writing songs for decades, and so he knew little phrases to stick in there that would sound pleasant if sung by a minstrel troupe. And I think that chorus, the Look Away repetition with Dixieland at the end sounds really good. So Look Away made it in, and that's the best I can come up with.
The song was and is popular because the music. The song was and is popular because the music is so wonderful. The lyrics are secondary.
Well, I would agree with you if all we were talking about was a popular song. If we were talking about Heartbreak Hotel, that would be satisfactory. But Heartbreak Hotel didn't become the national anthem, although it almost did, became the national anthem of a revolutionary movement, right? What's interesting about Dixie to me is not that it became popular at all. I think it's obvious why Dixie became popular. And you're right, the lyrics don't really matter. How many popular songs are out there that the lyrics don't matter? I mean, you could say the exact same thing about Yankee Doodle. I mean, Yankee Doodle's lyrics don't make much sense either. But Yankee Doodle, while it remains kind of an American anthem, never got that official kind of status. And a common argument you hear is that, well, if the Confederacy won, there would have been another anthem that might have come along. Dixie would have become the Confederacy's Yankee Doodle, right? A song that was popular during its independence movement, but then a real official anthem eventually comes along. And maybe that's so. We obviously can't, the Confederacy didn't win, so we don't know. But what's interesting about to me is not why it becomes so popular, but why it becomes so resonant. And again, and why we remember it. There were lots of 19th century songs that had very pleasant melodies that were fun to listen to that we don't know. We know Dixie because Dixie was the anthem of the Confederacy, and that's what's interesting about it to me, because you can score it to sound like a national anthem, which is what Arnold tried to do. But, I mean, the way it was originally meant to be performed was by, a blackface performer kind of goofily dancing around the stage singing it. This is not a national anthem, right? So, that's what's interesting about it to me. It's not why did it become so popular, but why did it become such a politically resonant song for Southerners. And that's what I tried to answer at least a little bit today. So.
Going to some of those other songs that we don't know as well, can you give some examples of how popular music tastes change on the home front as the war progresses, and do you start to see war weariness reflected that parallels what's happening?
Well, there's a long-standing argument that comes from a book written on Civil War music around the centennial, that sentimental songs with sentimental themes, like When This Cruel War Is Over, like Lorena in the South, that those songs supplant these bold patriotic songs like Dixie. Like in the South, the two main anthems of the South are Dixie and the Bonnie Blue Flag. The two big patriotic songs in the North are the Battle Cry of Freedom, and I say John Brown's Body, based on my research. And the argument is then that as war weariness creeps in, both in the armies and on the home front, that these sentimental songs supplant these political songs. I disagree with that. From what I found, I think on the home front, yes. A little bit. I think on the home front, there's sentimental songs are popular everywhere. Sentimental music is the most popular genre of music in America in the 19th century. Home Sweet Home is the most popular 19th century American song, hands down. However, during the Civil War, the songs that people keep coming back to are the political songs that they embraced at the beginning of the war. And those songs are the ones I just indicated. They're singing sentimental songs, but I didn't see from my research those sentimental songs ever supplanting those other songs. In the Confederacy, it happens at the end of the war because the Confederates lose. And so they don't want to sing the Bonnie Blue Flag and Dixie anymore. At least some of them don't, because it reminds them of the suffering of the war. In the North, if anything, I think the political songs become more prominent as the war goes on, especially once it's clear they're going to win. By the end of the war, they're all singing John Brown's Body and the Battle Cry of Freedom. And then they throw in Marching Through Georgia as their kind of end of the war anthem to boot. So I think that the war weariness obviously has some effect on musical taste. And clearly, more sentimental songs are published. Like the number of sentimental songs being published goes up as the war goes on. But and that's where that original argument comes from. That then they must have been more popular. I don't think so. I think there were more of them out there, and they remained, obviously people liked them, but I think those original anthems that both sides adopted at the beginning of the war stay the most popular war songs throughout the war, especially among the troops. So that's my 2 cents on war weariness anyway.
One more question.
Hi. You said the song was popular in the North. Was there a Union version of Dixie?
Yes, there were. There were a zillion versions of Dixie. I couldn't tell you the lyrics off the top of my head, but you see them crop up from time to time, even well into the 20th century, where people who don't know what the original lyrics were, they'll give you Pike's lyrics, the ones I showed you that were very much more pro-Confederate. They crop up all the time, and people think those are because it just doesn't make sense to say, because they look at someone will find the Emmett lyrics and go, well, they couldn't, this couldn't have been what it was. And then they'll find Pike's lyrics and they'll go, oh, it must have been this. This must have been what they were singing. And so sometimes you'll see Pike's lyrics crop up and people will say, oh yeah, this is what the Confederates sang. And it's the same in the Union. There were definitely Union versions. And again, I want to emphasize, this didn't just happen, songwriters didn't just do this. I found soldiers on both sides writing their own versions of Dixie, or you name it. I mean, not just Dixie, but they're all writing their own versions of these songs. So there's always these revisions going on, but particularly then with these political songs, because you can just graft whatever political messages you want on them. And so Dixie is rewritten in the North, in the South, probably on the other side of the Atlantic. Dixie is an international hit, and it becomes so again really well into in the 20th century as well. Like I said, I think if you were to play Dixie in Europe, people would recognize the song, which I don't think you could say that for, say, the Battle Cry of Freedom, or the Bonnie Blue Flag. I think you could say it for John Brown's Body, which becomes the Battle Hymn of the Republic. I think if you played that, people around the world would know that too, probably as the other big, hit of the Civil War that goes global. So.
Thank you very much for coming, and Dr. McWhorter will be here to autograph your book or answer questions for you.
Thank you.